If today were the last day of your life, how would you spend it? It's a cliché question, I know. But before you scroll away, hear me out. I'm not here to feed you another piece of motivational advice. I simply want you to stop for a moment and truly think about it. If today were the final day of your life, would you still spend the entire day angry because someone stepped on your foot during your morning commute? Would you still lie awake at night because of a careless comment from a coworker? Would you still keep the words, "I love you" hidden in your heart because you're afraid of being rejected? Most likely, you wouldn't. And that leads to the second question. If those things wouldn't matter at the end of your life, why do they feel like they matter more than anything on all the ordinary days in between? I ask this because I once lived through a period of my life when this question nearly drove me to my breaking point. I was 29 years old, working as a content director at a cultural media company. It sounded like an impressive title, but the reality was very different. Every day, I was drowning in anxiety and exhaustion. I lived in a constant state of tension. I worried that my boss wasn't satisfied with my work. I worried about what my coworkers thought of me. I worried that one wrong sentence would become something people talked about behind my back. I worried that a post I shared on social media would receive no likes. My emotions felt like those of a puppet controlled by countless invisible strings. A tiny pull on any one of them could send my entire world into chaos. One Saturday evening that autumn, I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment, staring at my phone. 15 minutes earlier, I had posted a photo on social media. 9 people had liked it. I refreshed the page again and again. A voice inside my head whispered, "Was the photo not good enough? Was the caption too dramatic? Did people see it and intentionally choose not to like it?" Then another voice appeared. "What are you doing? Is this really what you're spending your life worrying about?" The two voices fought inside my mind until I suddenly burst into tears. That night, I happened to come across an article about Adlerian psychology online. It mentioned a powerful idea. All problems are interpersonal relationship problems. The sentence felt like a needle piercing exactly the place where I was hurting the most. Following that thread, I discovered a book that would later change the way I looked at myself and my life. The Courage to be Disliked. The book, subtitled The Philosophy of Alfred Adler, unfolds through a 5-night dialogue between a young man and a philosopher. To be honest, I opened the book with skepticism. But by the time I reached the first night's conversation, I felt as if someone had turned on a flashlight and pointed it toward the hidden corners of my heart, the places I had spent years avoiding. The most powerful part of the book is that it begins with an idea that is extremely difficult to accept. The philosopher tells the story of a man who has been unable to leave his house for years. Deep down, he wants to go outside. But every time he tries, he experiences a racing heartbeat and trembling hands. Because of these symptoms, he believes he cannot change. From a traditional perspective, this explanation makes perfect sense. We would say, his past trauma caused his current condition. But Adlerian psychology completely rejects this cause and effect explanation. Instead, it offers a completely different perspective. The man first created the goal of not wanting to leave the house, and then his body produced symptoms like panic and trembling to help him achieve that goal. When I read that passage, I sat there for several seconds, completely stunned. It felt almost impossible to accept. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable it became. Perhaps this man stayed inside because, by doing so, he received attention and care from his family. If he stepped outside, he would simply become another ordinary person in the crowd. No one would treat him as special anymore. So, without realizing it, he used fear as a way to protect his chosen goal, staying home. In other words, we are not machines controlled by our past. We are individuals who move toward the goals we choose. This is what Adler called teleology, the idea that human behavior is driven not only by past causes, but also by future purposes. I closed the book and stared at the cracked ceiling of my apartment. Then I began examining my own symptoms. Was my procrastination really because I was naturally lazy? Or was procrastination a way for me to create a convenient excuse for possible failure? It's not that I'm incapable. I just didn't have enough time to prepare. Was my social anxiety really because I was simply introverted? Or was it because I was afraid of being hurt by others? So I built a protective shell and called it who I am. That night felt long, but strangely clear. I felt like I was peeling away layers of an onion, one by one, and every layer made my eyes burn. Over the next few days, I devoured the book like someone who had been starving for years, and finally found food. The second major concept it introduced was called separating tasks. The philosopher explains that all human suffering comes from relationships, and the deepest problem in relationships is that we constantly interfere with other people's tasks, or allow others to interfere with ours. The simplest way to identify whose task something belongs to is to ask who ultimately bears the consequences. For example, whether a child studies or not is ultimately the child's responsibility. Parents can offer guidance and support, but they cannot force, control, or attach their own pride and expectations to the child's choices. When I read that section, countless memories came rushing back. I thought about the year I chose my college major. I wanted to study Chinese literature, but my father asked, "What kind of job can you get with that degree?" So I chose accounting instead. I thought about every family gathering where relatives casually judged my choices and my life. I would smile and nod politely, even when my heart disagreed completely. I thought about work, where I was constantly afraid to say no when others pushed extra responsibilities onto me. I feared disappointing people. I feared being labeled difficult. I feared being left out. Only then did I realize how much of my life had been filled with blurred boundaries. I carried other people's responsibilities on my shoulders, walking through life exhausted and resentful. At the same time, I allowed others to step into my own territory and make decisions that were never theirs to make. I had lived like a human signpost standing there, displaying everyone else's expectations, while forgetting my own direction. And the ultimate purpose of separating tasks leads to 5 powerful words: the courage to be disliked. This is the moment when the title of the book truly reveals its sharpest edge. The courage to be disliked does not mean deliberately trying to make people hate you. It means that when you remain faithful to your own tasks, your own choices, and your own values, you will inevitably disappoint some people. You will be talked about. You may even be disliked. And if you are not willing to accept the possibility of being disliked, you will never experience true freedom. I closed the book and walked over to the mirror. Looking at myself, I suddenly understood a painful truth. The good relationships I had always been proud of were not built on genuine connection. They were the result of constantly suppressing myself and pleasing others in exchange for approval. That wasn't a relationship. It was a protection fee I paid with my own compromises. And even after paying that fee for years, I was still afraid. I was still anxious. Because the guarantee of not being disliked could disappear at any moment. One mistake, one disagreement, one failure to meet someone's expectations, and everything could collapse. It is difficult to describe that feeling. It was fear. It was clarity. It felt like standing naked under the sunlight, with every layer of protection stripped away. But strangely, underneath that burning discomfort, there was something else. A tiny spark of excitement. A quiet feeling, like a seed finally breaking through the soil after years of waiting. I sat back down and continued reading. The second half of the book explores a much broader idea: a sense of community. Adler believed that after a person learns to separate their tasks and stops living only to satisfy other people's expectations, they must move toward a wider stage of life. They must transform their obsession with themselves into genuine concern for others and find their place within a larger community. But this does not mean returning to the old pattern of pleasing people. Instead, it means building equal, horizontal relationships while maintaining an independent sense of self. Not relationships based on control where people constantly praise or criticize each other, but relationships built on sincere gratitude and encouragement. One idea from the book completely changed the way I looked at life. As long as you exist, you have value. The philosopher explains that we should not judge people based on their actions, but based on their existence. For example, an elderly person who is bedridden may not be able to accomplish anything. They may not be productive or achieve anything measurable, but their existence alone can bring comfort and happiness to their family. Their value does not come from what they do. Their value comes from the simple fact that they are here. That night, my mother happened to call me. Normally, I answered her calls with a little impatience because she always repeated the same questions. Have you eaten? Is it cold where you are? Don't stay up so late. But that night, as I listened to her familiar voice on the phone, my eyes suddenly became warm. I thought about those words from the book. I thought about my mother. She didn't need to accomplish anything extraordinary. She didn't need to prove her worth through achievements. The fact that she simply existed in this world, that I could hear her voice when I answered the phone, was already something incredibly valuable to me. After the call ended, I lay in bed for a long time. For 29 years, I had measured everything through the standard of achievement, including myself. How successful was my career? How much money did I make? How many people interacted with my posts? What did others think of me? I was like a student who was constantly taking an invisible exam, always checking a report card that only existed in my imagination. And I had never allowed myself to believe that I was worthy simply because I existed. That night in October, I lost sleep because of a book. But it wasn't the restless insomnia caused by anxiety. It was a slow, deep kind of sleeplessness, the kind that happens when something inside you is quietly being rebuilt. In the months that followed, I began changing my life little by little. The changes were nothing like the dramatic movie montages where inspirational music starts playing. The main character gets a new look, begins working out, and suddenly reaches the peak of success. My changes were small, ordinary, messy, and often filled with hesitation and struggle. For example, one day at work, a coworker tried to push a task onto me that was clearly part of her own responsibility. In the past, I would have forced myself to accept it. Then I would stay late working, silently complain about her 100 times in my head, and eventually become angry at myself for being unable to say no. But that day, I took a deep breath and said, "Sorry, I already have several urgent tasks on my plate. I don't think I can take this one on." The moment the words left my mouth, my heartbeat became so loud it felt like someone was pounding a drum next to my ears. She looked surprised. There was a brief flash of frustration on her face, but she didn't argue. She simply turned around and asked someone else. After she walked away, I sat at my desk. I didn't feel the overwhelming fear I had always imagined would come after disappointing someone. Instead, I felt something strangely unfamiliar. Relief. It was as if I had been carrying a heavy backpack my entire life, and that day I finally removed one small item from it. The item was small, but the realization behind it was enormous. I was allowed to say no, and that realization created a small crack in my old world, a crack where light could finally enter. More cracks appeared over time. I stopped replying to every message instantly. I stopped forcing myself to laugh at every joke just to fit in. I stopped carefully managing an image of myself online. I started taking writing classes on weekends. It was a continuation of the Chinese literature dream I had abandoned years earlier because my father didn't believe it was practical. There were only 7 people in the class. I was the oldest student there, but every time I sat in that small classroom, holding a pen and writing words on a blank page, I felt something close to happiness flowing through me. Of course, freedom came with a price. Some people told me I had changed, that I had become less social. One former coworker even said behind my back, "Has he gotten too confident lately? He barely talks to anyone anymore." When those words eventually reached me, they still hurt. The little child inside me, the one who wanted everyone's approval, had not completely disappeared. But this time, I didn't explain myself. I didn't try to fix the relationship. I didn't send a message saying, "Sorry, I've just been really busy lately. Let's hang out sometime." I simply sat with the uncomfortable feeling of being talked about. And I told myself, see, this is what it feels like to be disliked. It isn't as deadly as you imagined. You are still alive. You are still breathing. And tomorrow, the sun will rise as usual. 6 months later, I resigned from my job at the cultural company. Not because of one specific event, but because a truth had become clearer and clearer. This position was not something I had chosen. It was something I had slowly drifted into while following other people's expectations. Just like years earlier, when I chose accounting because it was what my father wanted, I decided to open a small independent bookstore with a writing space. Almost everyone opposed the idea. My mother said stability mattered most. My friends said physical bookstores were a dying industry. My former co-workers said I was being too idealistic. But this time, I didn't give in. Because I understood one thing clearly. This was my task. The bookstore might fail. I might lose money. I might have to close it years later and walk away disappointed. But those consequences belonged to me. And I was willing to carry them. I no longer needed other people's approval to justify my choices. The bookstore is tucked away in an old neighborhood. It isn't large, just over 600 square feet. With one wall lined entirely with bookshelves and 6 wooden tables, scattered throughout the room. I named it Existence Bookshop. Some people smiled the moment they heard the name, understanding the philosophy behind it. Others asked why I had chosen something that sounded so unusual, insisting it wasn't literary enough. I simply smiled. I never explained. One afternoon during the bookstore's 3rd month of business, sunlight streamed through the glass front door, casting warm patterns across the wooden floor. Tiny specks of dust drifted lazily through the golden light. There were only 2 customers. A young woman sat quietly in the corner reading. A middle-aged man wandered slowly between the shelves, browsing without any hurry. I sat behind the counter, looking at a scene that was almost painfully quiet. Yet inside me, I felt something I had never experienced before. Peace. Real peace. I remembered the final conversation in The Courage to be Disliked. The young man asks the philosopher, "What is the meaning of life?" The philosopher answers, "Life has no universal meaning. The meaning of life is the meaning you choose to give it." Then he says something even more beautiful. If you shine the spotlight on this very moment, if you live fully in the present, then neither the past nor the future truly exists. Every single moment is complete in itself. The dance of this moment is already its own meaning. It took me nearly 30 years to truly understand those words. For years, I lived in the past, endlessly replaying things that had already happened. At the same time, I lived in the future, worrying about things that hadn't happened yet. I had almost never lived in the present. But that quiet afternoon, sitting inside my little bookstore, watching dust dance through the sunlight, I suddenly realized something with absolute clarity. I am here. I am alive. And this moment, exactly as it is, already has meaning. So after telling my story, let me share what this book ultimately taught me. At its core, The Courage to be Disliked invites us through 3 profound shifts in perspective. The first shift is moving from a mindset of causes to a mindset of purpose. Most of us spend our lives searching the past for explanations: our childhood, our family, old wounds, painful failures. Those experiences are real. They matter. But when we use them as permanent excuses, we also surrender our power to change. Adler reminds us that every behavior serves a purpose, even if we are unwilling to admit what that purpose is. Once you discover it, you begin taking back the steering wheel of your own life. The second shift is learning to separate tasks and having the courage to be disliked. This is perhaps the book's most challenging lesson. It asks us to distinguish between what belongs to us and what belongs to others. To stop controlling other people's lives. To stop allowing other people to control ours. It requires giving up the endless hunger for approval and accepting that some people will misunderstand you, disagree with you, or even dislike you. Freedom always comes with a price. Sometimes that price is disappointing other people, but it is a price worth paying. The third shift is discovering a sense of community while fully accepting yourself. Many people mistakenly believe Adler encourages selfishness. He doesn't. Separating tasks is not the destination. It is only the beginning. Real happiness comes from remaining true to yourself while still caring deeply about others. From finding your place within something larger than yourself. And none of that is possible until you learn one simple truth. Your value does not depend on what you accomplish. Your value begins with your existence. You are worthy not because of what you produce, but because you are here. Together, these three ideas form a complete journey. From living for other people's expectations, to living according to your own values, and finally, to living alongside others without losing yourself. Before I finish, I'd like to say something directly to you. Maybe you've felt lonely late at night. Maybe you've stayed too long in relationships that exhausted you. Maybe you've looked at your own life and quietly wondered, what am I doing all of this for? If so, you're not alone. I've been there too. Even now, I can't say I've completely transformed into someone who is fearless or unaffected by other people's opinions. I'm still learning, still practicing, still becoming. There is one sentence from the philosopher that has stayed with me ever since I closed the book. Life is not a line. It is a series of dots. If you think life is a line stretching endlessly towards some distant destination, then today will always feel like nothing more than another stop along the way. You'll always be chasing, always waiting, always believing happiness exists somewhere else. But if each moment is a complete point, if each day is allowed to be whole on its own, then no matter where you are, and no matter what you're doing, your life is already complete in this very moment. So don't wait. Remember the question we began with. If today were the last day of your life, how would you spend it? Now you know the answer. Live every day as if it truly mattered. Not to satisfy someone else's expectations. Not to earn approval. Not to avoid being disliked. But to live honestly. To live courageously. And perhaps for the very first time, to live your own life.